Well, good evening and welcome, friends, to this very timely lecture, 2 days before Europe Day. Before we begin, some housekeeping. The event is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your camera. You're muted, and whilst there will be an opportunity to ask questions, you should do so in the chat. But please, when you put something in the chat, put question in capital letters. Belinda, Mike and Richard will keep their eyes on the chat, and I will read out the questions in due course. Finally, a huge thanks to the European Movement for hosting this event, and I hope that you will join if you haven't done so already. So again, welcome to this, the third annual Memorial Lecture in honour of Julian Priestley, a wonderful European. It's a celebration of his life and his enormous contribution, not only to promoting the European ideal, but also to realising it. He did so as a superb public servant, but also as an activist. He helped to shape and build the European Union that we have just abandoned. The EU is certainly not perfect, but it gave us so much as individuals and as a country: peace, including in Northern Ireland, prosperity, freedoms and rights, not to mention friendships and strength from a shared belief in common liberal values. I pay tribute to Belinda Pike, Mike Shackleton and Richard Corbett for establishing the lectures. And this year, I'm particularly delighted to welcome Bobby Mcdonough. Bobby and Julian were good friends whose lives and networks were interlinked. Whilst Julian's career, whilst diverse, was rooted in the European Parliament, Bobby's career as a diplomat weaved in and out and around the EU and its institutions. Bobby and Julian were both at Balliol. I'm in Oxford this evening, and it's great that my friend and colleague Helen Ghosh, the Master of Balliol, is with us. Also Chris Patton, an alum, and there are undoubtedly many others. Another celebrated alum is, of course, the Prime Minister, who, like Bobby, read classics and both the presidents of the Oxford Union. But perhaps the similarities end there. Bobby is not shameless. He is a man of deep values and integrity. He's been a great participant in and observer of history in the making. He's helped to shape and determine countless policies, and he's influenced the direction of the EU as well as his own country, Ireland. He's a man of reason and passion. He has extraordinary experience and insights. Fortunately, he sometimes shares those insights as a commentator and a journalist, and this evening he will do so as our speaker. I'm sure that many of you, like me, are still despairing of our situation post-Brexit. Indeed, perhaps like me, you're also depressed by the election result in Hartlepool. Julian certainly would have been. The populists won, at least that's my view. We are desperately in need of hope. So this evening, it will be a joy to hear a lecture with the title, Britain and Europe, The Hope Still Lives. Bobby, over to you.
Baroness Royal Jan, thank you very much for your excessively kind introduction. It is an honour to deliver the third annual Julian Priestley Lecture. Julian was a colleague for whom I had immense admiration, as well as a friend for whom I had great affection. I'm pleased that so many of you, including many of Julian's friends and colleagues, have been able to join us this evening, and particularly delighted to welcome Julian's husband, Jean. Appropriately, today we mark Europe Day, which this year falls on a Sunday. It is an occasion to celebrate the European Union, a project for peace and unity on our continent, which remains of immense importance to the people of Europe and to the wider world. When we think of those who died in the great conflicts of the last century, and say sincerely we will remember them, we cannot but have a special place in our hearts for the achievements and aspirations of the European Union. I have to confess that as an official who spent more than 3 decades working in and with the European institutions, that my initial enthusiasm on receiving the invitation to deliver this lecture was quickly dampened by some uncertainty and trepidation. Because the organisers of the event thoughtfully sent me the text of the previous Julian Priestley lecture delivered by Francis O'Grady, Secretary General of the TUC. And there in black and white, at the outset of her eloquent address, Frances could not have made it more plain. Not for Julian, she insisted, a Europe of diplomats and technocrats. Surely some mistake, I thought. How could I have got the gig? How could the organisers of the lecture possibly have thought it wise to invite a lifelong diplomat and technocrat to try to do justice to Julian's legacy? On reflection, however, I concluded that Julian would probably be content enough that a public servant should address you today. For Julian, even if he had a superb instinct for politics, was himself a public servant. If Julian's Europe was not one of diplomats and technocrats, that is because he recognized, as I do, that bureaucracy is not an end in itself, that officials are not independent operators, and that the work we do must be under the direction of elected politicians and ultimately in the service of a higher cause. It was to the service of such a higher cause, namely the construction of a decent and democratic European Union with Britain at its heart, that Julian dedicated his immense talents as well as his distinguished career. Indeed, I believe that Julian, having witnessed the beginning of both the Trump era and the Brexit fiasco, would, if he were with us today, insist more strongly than ever on the crucial role of public servants. It is not by chance that in several countries recently, we have seen admirable public servants pilloried in the stocks of self-interested populism. Notably in the UK, experts were triumphantly and explicitly sidelined by the Pied Pipers of Brexit, the success of whose cause depended fundamentally on the pretense that there are simple answers to complex problems, that rational arguments do not need to be weighed up one against the other. The Brexit debate was not so much about pros and cons as the propagation of one massive con. Nor is it a coincidence that in recent years, several exceptional senior British civil servants have found themselves sidelined or moved on for such heinous offences as speaking truth to power, insisting on respect for the ministerial code on bullying, or standing by the rule of international law. In a world and in an era in which science, experience, knowledge, and even basic facts have been increasingly sacrificed on the altar of superficial soundbites, objective professional analysis and advice are more vital than ever. The crying need to deal with the COVID threat has at last begun to make some inroads into the casual triumph of amateurish insouciance. Education at all levels is, of course, the greatest bulwark against populism. I was delighted, therefore, that Somerville College initially offered, had COVID restrictions so permitted, to host this lecture in Oxford, and that the principal of this distinguished college has kindly agreed to chair it online. I'm also delighted, as I'm sure Julian would be, that the European movement, of which he remained a member throughout his life, is hosting this event on Zoom. Had Julian lived, he would have graced the recent British-European debate with his intelligence, judgment, and passion. Nobody would have made the case for Britain and Europe more effectively than him. Nobody would be more horrified than Julian that those who will now suffer most from Brexit are those in Labour's natural heartlands, who were misled by politicians who cared more for their votes than for their well-being. Nobody would be more disappointed with the largely insular path on which, for the moment, Britain is now set, an insular path concealed under the banner of going global. Despite recent developments, I have chosen an upbeat title for this lecture, as I am sure Julian would have wished. When Teddy Kennedy failed in 1980 to win the Democratic nomination for president, he chose to speak not of his regret, but rather of his hope for the future. In a similar vein, the theme on which I propose to offer you some reflections this evening, 15 months into Brexit, gently echoes Kennedy's rallying cry of 40 years ago: the hope still lives. Before turning to the substance of this lecture, I would like to recall briefly my personal memories of Julian. Our paths crossed during 3 separate periods of our lives. I first got to know Julian when I arrived as an undergraduate at Oxford nearly half a century ago. Julian had just left Balliol at the end of Trinity term in 1972 when I arrived at the college after that summer break. I therefore only met him during my Oxford years on his occasional return visits, but Julian, perhaps more than any other student of his generation, remained a presence even after his departure. Julian Priestley remained a name to conjure with. At Balliol, in the Labour Club, of which I became a member, and at the Oxford Union, where a few years later I followed him as president. I might add that the small group of Balliol ex-presidents of the Oxford Union was one to which, for many years, I was unreservedly proud to belong. Alas, in more recent times, for a reason I can't quite put my finger on, that pride has taken something of a hit. Julian was, from the beginning, a deeply committed British European. As a student, he had been involved in setting up the Oxford Committee for Europe, which by my time was affectionately, if cheekily, sometimes referred to as the Oxford Committee for Priestley. If one word could capture Julian from my first encounters with him, it would be the word charisma. It is fitting that this evening's Zoom audience includes, as Jan said, the Chancellor of Julian's University, Chris Patton, and the Master of his Oxford College, Helen Crosh. My second memories of Julian relate to the 5 years during which we overlapped in Luxembourg after I arrived there to take up my first diplomatic posting. Initially friends and neighbours, we became colleagues when I joined the Secretariat of the European Parliament, where Julian was already a high flyer, who always provided me with support and encouragement, as well as much fun at the competitive games evenings which he organised. If I were to choose one word from that period which came to characterise Julian in my eyes, it would be the word courtesy. A surprising word perhaps, but Julian exuded a particular courtesy to everyone he met, including, I remember vividly, to my own parents when they visited Luxembourg. I was fortunate that although I soon returned to the Irish diplomatic service, I had the opportunity later to work for a third time with Julian when he was Secretary General of the European Parliament and I was Ireland's EU Director General in Dublin and later Permanent Representative in Brussels. While Julian would have graced either the House of Commons, for which he stood 3 times as a Labour candidate, or Downing Street, where Tony Blair offered him the position of Chief of Staff, Julian's period as Secretary General of European Parliament Secretariat offered him a perfect opportunity to deploy his immense personal and political talents and to shape significantly the Europe that he loved. The word I would associate with Julian during that third period of our friendship is the word personality. His personal impact was a powerful reminder that the European Union has been shaped above all by outstanding individuals, many of them, of course, proudly and passionately British, and several of whom are participating in this Zoom call. This evening, therefore, we recall Julian's charisma, courtesy, and unique personality. Let me say a word now about the title of the lecture, Britain and Europe, The Hope Still Lives. I will not be suggesting this evening that the United Kingdom is set to rejoin the European Union, at least within any foreseeable timeframe, or indeed that that will necessarily happen. Still less will I be arguing that now would be the appropriate moment to launch any formal campaign to that end. That would be both foolhardy and counterproductive. Reversing Brexit is far from being the only way for the UK to re-establish a closer relationship with the EU than the minimalist one chosen by the present British government that has set a deep historic friendship along a narrow and doleful road. Rather, the hope still lives, the strong hope, that the hard Brexit sought and delivered by Prime Minister Johnson is not the last word of the British people on their country's relationship with its European neighbours. The present government has for the moment an unassailable parliamentary majority. It cannot be prevented from continuing to prioritise the narrowest view of what constitutes sovereignty and the unity of the Conservative Party over other considerations, including common sense. But politics always move on eventually. If, as they say, a week is a long time in politics, 5 to 10 years is a veritable age. Already some voices are calling for a more sensible relationship with Europe. Someday there will be a British government and parliament of a different political hue. The Labour Party is a fundamentally pro-European party and will, in government, work for a closer relationship with Europe, one more aligned with British interests and more in harmony with the centre of gravity of British public opinion. Rejoining the EU is not on the Labour Party's present agenda, but many in the party would like to see that happen, and political calculations evolve with time. The Lib Dems, the Greens, the SNP and others will also make their voices heard. Indeed, who can tell how the thinking of the Conservative Party itself, that brought the UK into Europe and has traditionally attached importance to British business interests, will evolve. Moreover, Brexit realities are already proving to be wildly different from the Brexit promises, as so many of those poor deluded experts had predicted. Some people may for now, understandably, want to move on from the bitterness and boredom of the Brexit process. But over time, many will not be so willing to move on from the lost opportunities, the diminished rights, the truncated identity, the waning of national influence, and the obstacles to prosperity. I speak today as an Irishman whose island, north and south, is deeply affected by Brexit, who has many close friends and family in the UK, and who has a deep affection for Britain. But I therefore speak as a foreigner. Needless to say, I have no particular claim to be able to predict the future of Britain's relationship with Europe. I therefore offer my thoughts today with some humility and hesitation. However, I would emphasise that nobody can confidently predict or determine that future. Whether Britain will someday seek a closer relationship with the EU or possibly even rejoin will not be decided by the present government alone or by any future British government. It will not be decided by the tabloids or commentariat, or indeed by the European movement. It will be decided by the British people in all their diversity and evolving wisdom, including by the young people who voted overwhelmingly for Britain to remain in the EU, and the millions of other young people who have since reached voting age or will do so in the coming years. In memory of Julian, but with his voice still in our ears, no one should be intimidated or silenced by those who argue that Brexit has been done, that all further debate is foreclosed, that Britain's relationship with its neighbours has been set in stone. Many of those who now insist that democracy, having spoken, must forever hold its peace are the very people who never accepted over 50 years the outcome of the UK's first EU referendum. Julian's important book, 6 Battles That Shaped Europe's Parliament, is a powerful testament to his political judgment and impact. It occurred to me that it might be appropriate this evening to address briefly 6 other difficult battles that lie ahead that could perhaps shape the evolution of Britain's relationship with Europe. No one can say for certain what the outcome of those battles will be. What is certain is that those battles must be engaged if hope and history, in fulfillment of Heaney's promise, are once again to rhyme. The first immediate battle ahead will be to challenge the underlying Brexit narrative, namely that the people have had their say and can never express any other opinion forevermore. This battle will last many years, but it should be engaged in earnest now. Political defeat must not be allowed to become political defeatism. The idea that the 2016 referendum was a cut and dried, once and for all, never to be reversed political event is taking significant hold, despite the fact that some Brexiteers had campaigned relentlessly for more than 4 decades to overturn the earlier British EU referendum, despite the inevitability that Leave campaigners would themselves have insisted on another referendum if their side had lost by a few percentage points, as Farage stated explicitly in the days before the referendum, despite the utter lack of clarity of what sort of Brexit the people were being asked to vote for, and despite the witch's cauldron of untruths at the heart of the Leave campaign. Britain has, of course, left the European Union. Now is obviously not the time to start any foolhardy campaign for another referendum. However, there is a real opportunity, I would say responsibility, to challenge the underlying narrative. Namely, as I said, the British people have spoken definitively, that Britain's relationship with Europe has been settled for good, and that those who disagree should just shut up. It is time to move on from licking wounds to licking some arguments into shape. 3 underlying arguments in particular seem important. The first argument relates to the dangerous view of what constitutes the British people. Since the 2016 referendum, a casual mantra has been deployed about what the so described British people voted for. The harder the Brexit, apparently, the more the British people voted for it. The simple fact is that the British people, who were not presented with the glimmer of a prospectus for Brexit, were deeply divided on Europe in 2016 and remain so today. The fact that one side won the referendum narrowly does not justify repeated claims to know and represent what the so-called British people voted for, as Farage, Prime Minister May and her successor have done relentlessly. More recently, it has been suggested that the British general election in December 2019 further settled the matter by confirming the British people's support for a particular hard form of Brexit. This is, of course, utter nonsense. The first past the post electoral system delivered a significant victory to the Conservative Party. However, although the subject of staggeringly little media comment, the majority of British voters in 2019 supported parties that favoured a second Brexit referendum. The Hartlepool by-election, in a constituency that voted 69% for Brexit, 55% for either the Conservative Party or the Brexit Party in 2019, and 51% for the Tories today, does not change the equation that is already there. Winning a referendum or a majority of seats in the House of Commons is an important democratic event, but it does not give the victors the right to talk grandly about what the British people want, when what they mean is, at most, approximately half the British people. Nor does it absolve the British media from the responsibility to avoid such misrepresentation. The history of 20th century Europe warns us of the dangers of identifying only part of a country's population with its people. It is thus important to keep alive the legitimate narrative that there is nothing remotely undemocratic or improper in working for a deeper relationship with Europe than the current settlement, or even in seeking, in the fullness of time, to reconsider British EU membership. It is both reasonable and wise to begin now working gently to ensure that the terrain of British public debate on Europe is not, like the land of defeated Carthage, sown so comprehensively with the salt of self-righteous triumphalism that any flowering of a return to rational multilateralism in Europe would struggle to take root, even when a more favourable climate someday returns, as it will. The second argument that should be made is that the specific hard form of Brexit now in place bears no resemblance to what leading Brexiteers promised, insofar as their promises had any content during the referendum campaign. It would have been possible to leave Europe on the sort of terms that Johnson himself vaguely dangled in front of the electorate in 2016, according to which access to the single market would be largely undisturbed. However, to adapt Johnson's infamous metaphor, eaten cake is soon forgotten. Failing that, it would have been possible to explore a relationship with the EU similar to the one Theresa May was seeking, which, while falling short of the full benefits of membership, would have minimised the national damage. Failing even that, it would have been possible at the very least to seek a deal with Europe along the lines of that set out in the agreed EU-UK joint political declaration in 2019, which formed part of the so-called oven-ready deal, which the British electorate were implicitly invited to endorse in that year's general election. However, it became clear quickly that the intention was always to change substantially the ingredients even of that oven-ready deal, a deal that held the promise of better market access in return for the political declaration, the agreed declaration, called robust level playing field conditions, a sensible trade-off subsequently disowned by British negotiators. The third argument to be advanced with a view to shaping a more truthful long-term European narrative in Britain is that the hardline stance of the Johnson government, prioritising so-called sovereignty over everything else, including the aspirations of half the population, has not only ignored their point of view, but has essentially disrespected it. Repeated assertions of a wish to unite the country, if they are to mean anything at all, must surely take some slight account of the views of the large part of the British population that still aspires to a closer relationship with Europe. The pursuit of a minimalist deal, followed now by an ongoing policy of distancing the UK from its European neighbours, can only deepen divisions between and within the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. The millions of British people who marched with great dignity a few years ago, with European flags in their hands, or who admired them for doing so, are being given a consistent, simple message. That message, in the favoured Downing Street style of three-word political messaging, is suck it up. The belated decision to reverse the gratuitous downgrading of the status of the EU embassy in London is welcome. However, London's continued policy of seeking to deal with individual member states rather than with the EU as a whole is misguided and incidentally entirely out of step with the Biden government, which is prioritising a very close relationship with the European Union and its institutions. The British government's policies should be judged against its stated intention of uniting the country. At some point, surely, some minimal account needs to be taken of those in every constituent part of the United Kingdom who do not celebrate every step that distance the United Kingdom from the European Union or cheer when Royal Navy ships in a pre-election stunt are dispatched to Jersey. The proposed National Brexit Festival next year, a festival to celebrate the most divisive event in modern British history, copper-fastens the government's message. The organisers of the Brexit Festival have invited ideas on how the festival, I jest not, can be used to unite the country. I have a simple proposal, and it's well within budget. Cancel the festival, or at least recast it as something less divisive, which would necessarily involve plenty of European flags. So this first battle is to start engaging more effectively in the tussle between underlying narratives before it is too late. To abstain on the one hand from the overreach of talking up an early reversal of Brexit, but to avoid on the other being stunned into inaction by the recent hammer blows or by tabloid intimidation. The second battle ahead concerns the future direction and success of the European Union itself, the chosen frontline of Julian's career. The European debate in the UK will be significantly influenced by how the EU copes with the challenges ahead. The EU's two long-term priorities are well chosen: the greening of our societies and the digital agenda. The EU is rightly prioritising those important, vastly complex issues, which will in many respects define the world in which our children will live. The EU is demonstrating significant leadership in those areas, even if progress will necessarily be halting, uneven, and dependent on others. However, everyone's best laid plans have been disrupted by COVID. The EU is no exception. It has no claims to covering itself with particular glory in the context of COVID and has made significant mistakes. But then the same can be said of pretty well every country in the world, including the UK. The EU acted too slowly, in part because it does not have the necessary competences. On vaccines in particular, the EU's initial response could certainly have been more effective, although much of the criticism directed at the EU in the British media has been misplaced and exaggerated. Dealing with COVID will be a long and complex challenge. Vaccines, on which the EU is now rapidly getting up to speed, are only one important dimension. Comparative judgments about overall performance, in which mortality rates will be the most important metric, can only be made in the fullness of time. The vast array of other challenges facing Europe also includes the departure of an important and valued member state, the understandable aspiration of other countries to join, the future of the Eurozone. It could be argued that the most difficult long-term challenge of all will be migration, a problem with which the EU is grappling imperfectly, but not a problem of Europe's making, except insofar as we have created on our continent a prosperous and decent society where millions of people not only want to live, but to reach which they have often been willing to risk their lives and those of their families. I would like to touch briefly on three other particular challenges at European level that could impact on British public opinion when it returns, as someday it must, to a political serenity that allows it to reflect rationally on the UK's interests and place in the world. First, the EU must work to develop further the single market, to a significant extent a British conception, and to protect the integrity of that market. The single market has significantly enhanced the prosperity of Europe, including the United Kingdom. However, there is much more to accomplish, both in terms of the market for services and the digital single market. That work should continue for its own sake, sadly without the advocacy of the UK, which would have continued to be a prime mover and prime beneficiary of that work. Success with that agenda, important for Europe itself, will also further increase the attractiveness of the single market for British businesses, workers, and voters when the populist tempest subsides. Thanks to the Ayatollahs of Brexit, the single market, once the jewel in Britain's crown, has become the thorn in Britain's side. But the whirligig of time, as Shakespeare tells us, will surely someday take another spin. Preserving the integrity of the single market was the EU's principal red line in the Brexit negotiations, and will remain so as its relationship with the UK evolves. Ironically, it is a racing certainty that if any member state other than the UK had decided to leave the EU, the strongest defender of the integrity of the single market today would not be the infidels in Paris, but God's elect in London. Set against the long list of red lines emanating from London during the Brexit negotiations, which the EU accepted, the EU itself had essentially only two red lines of its own: the protection of its single market and the preservation, insofar as Brexit allows, of the balances of the Good Friday Agreement. Red lines can sometimes be mistaken for red rags, but the EU continues to have a responsibility to maintain its basic principles for the long-term well-being of the European continent and of my own island. A second European challenge that could impact in the longer run on perceptions of Europe and Britain will be Europe's response to the challenges posed in Poland and Hungary, to the independence of the judiciary and the wider institutions of democracy. This is a sensitive, complex, and strategic issue to which there is no simple fix. But in the longer run, finding a way to bite that bullet more decisively will be important, not only for Europe itself, but would, I believe, have a positive impact on British public opinion. The UK has, of course, faced populist challenges of its own. For example, with the attacks on the judiciary as enemies of the people, sustained criticism of patriotic politicians as traitors, and even an attempt to prorogue Parliament. Indeed, some Brexiteers have a particular affinity with the populism and insular nationalism currently on view in Hungary and Poland. However, I'm certain that the decency of the vast majority of British people and their deep attachment to democracy will ride out the populist wave, and that the UK will one day not only fully reaffirm the European values, which it has done so much to shape, but will once again take a lead in asserting them. The third challenge at European level that will impact on Britain's view of Europe is an external one: the need for the EU to redouble its efforts to defend multilateralism, to strengthen international institutions, and to provide our deeply challenged word with leadership, as necessary as it is imperfect, in bolstering the interdependence of nations. In a world in which insularity has made something of a comeback, in which for some patriotism and selfishness have become intertwined, the European Union has both an opportunity and a responsibility to assert the values that underpin and inspire it. Multilateral organizations have been under threat, not because of their own inevitable imperfection, but because those who would undermine them falsely preach that simple, perfect, winner takes all, take back control answers are possible. It is regrettable that the UK decided to leave the most important and influential multilateral organization to which it belonged. The underlying psychology of that decision, notably what it says about recognizing the need for compromise and cooperation, raises inevitable questions about the UK's approach to wider international engagement. However, it is to be warmly welcomed that the UK, despite Brexit, is in principle standing firmly by most other aspects of its commitment to multilateralism, including the United Nations, even if its steep cuts in development assistance have been strongly criticised within the Conservative Party itself. It is important that, notwithstanding the UK's earlier explicitly announced intention of breaking international law in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol and its subsequent decision to act unilaterally in relation to its provisions, it has now stated clearly that it intends to abide by its legal obligations and appears to be acting in good faith in working with the EU to find practical solutions. This week's leaking by Downing Street of the intention unilaterally again to break previous agreements on the prosecution of serious crimes in Northern Ireland for short-term electoral advantage is disturbing. It is important that the UK now continues to respect the legally binding protocol and otherwise to assert the importance of international law. The EU and UK must work together and be seen to work together on such shared priorities and values. With the election of President Biden, the United States has placed itself once again firmly on the side of multilateralism. The US and the EU are set to be the two main pillars of Western democratic interests and values. It is essential that they find optimal ways to work with the UK as well as with other international friends and partners. To conclude then on this second battle, the one that must be fought by the EU itself to shape its own future, it is certain that there will be successes and mistakes. The EU will set about its own challenges for its own reasons in pursuit of its own values and its own interests. But I hope that in doing so, it would be possible, by further strengthening its market, its democratic values, and its constructive global role, to provide fertile ground for a renewed debate in Britain about its relationship with Europe. When the UK finds its way back to being the confident, outward-looking nation that so shaped Europe over the last half-century, it will, I believe, turn back towards its natural friends. The EU must work in the period ahead, including for its own sake, to contribute to a vibrant multilateral world in which the UK can be its closest friend and partner. The third of the 6 battles to shape Britain's future relationship with the European continent is the battle to explain the European Union truthfully to the public. This is obviously an immense challenge also in the 27 member states, but it is particularly acute in a country in which the seeds of Brexit took root in the soil of frivolous drivel about square bananas and prawn-flavoured crisps, a fairy tale to scare the children, conjured into believable reality by a mendacious tabloid media. The great lie about Europe in Britain became so pervasive that in truth, those who voted for Brexit in 2016 did not vote to leave the European Union at all, but rather to leave a figment of popular imagination. A fictional drama directed by Nigel Farage, screenplay by Dominic Cummings, based on an original story by Boris Johnson. Of course, some British politicians across all parties have behaved with great integrity, and some British media coverage of Europe has been and continues to be excellent. But it is no more than a statement of the obvious to say that many media outlets in the UK continue systematically to misrepresent the EU's nature, to ignore its successes, and to exaggerate its faults. The largely cost-free Brexit promised by Brexiteers is proving, as was always inevitable, to have stinging economic costs. As the costs grow and become more evident, the advocates of Brexit will remain unwilling to acknowledge the damage they have inflicted. They will opt for the Bart Simpson defense. I didn't do it, no one saw me do it, you can't prove anything. Severely constrained access to the single market is already being portrayed as the result of European cussedness, rather than the direct consequence of a British choice. Bad decisions, deliberately and consciously chosen, will continue to be blamed on the purported bad faith of others. The problem is compounded by silence. As Nick Cohen has pointed out in The Observer, the real conspiracy in a time of bogus conspiracy theories is the conspiracy of silence about the negative impact of Brexit. The government won't talk about it, Cohen has written, The opposition dare not mention it. The right-wing press won't cover it. It is swept under the COVID carpet. The UK government and its tabloid cheerleaders seem to believe that by the simple expedient of ignoring the elephant in the room, Nellie will discreetly pack up her trunk and go back to the circus. It will be a steep uphill battle to counteract this misinformation. It will require political courage across the spectrum, engagement across society, and hopefully some growing sense of self-respect across the media. The list of fictions about the EU is endless, from the EU being a faceless bureaucracy to the UK's alleged lack of influence as a member state, from the EU falling apart to its being at the same time a superstate. It is vital to try to ensure that legitimate and, where necessary, robust criticism of the EU does not translate, as it so often does in Britain, into a questioning of the EU's existence or purpose, and that healthy scepticism does not morph into deep-rooted cynicism about the EU's value or the possibility of the eventual return of Britain to a closer relationship with it, whatever form that may take. The fourth of the six battles is a related one, namely the global assault on truth that extends well beyond Brexit and Europe. It is a global struggle these days to try to ensure that words have any meaning at all. The importance of words, the sacredness of words, is now severely challenged. When the world's greatest purveyor of fake news can spend 4 years in the White House describing reality as fake, presenting fictions as alternative facts, the size of the problem is evident. The connection between words and truth has become increasingly tenuous. Nowadays, words are often mere playthings for spicing up a soundbite, for shaping a slogan. Words may have lost their meaning, but they have not lost their importance. They are the means by which we can break down even the oldest and most seemingly impenetrable of barriers. British-Irish relations, for example, improved beyond recognition in recent decades because of the words of mutual respect, honest recognition, and heartfelt empathy in both directions that came to characterize the relationship. Words are also at the very basis of the European Union, a union created, inspired, defined, and strictly limited by written treaties and written law, a union defined by the constructive use of words, of which the UK was an outstanding exponent. Words are the stuff of compromise, the necessary material for shaping the fair principles and respectful compromises which characterize the European Union. There is nothing wrong with fudge when the alternative is conflict, or indeed gunboats. There can surely have been no greater corruptions of language during Brexit than the calculated comparison of the European Union to the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, or the sustained language in the House of Commons about betrayal, traitors, surrender, bills, and collaborators, one of whom happened to be Winston Churchill's grandson. Nowhere is the challenge of language more important than to lay the groundwork for a serious future debate about Europe and Britain. The fifth battleground concerns Scotland and Northern Ireland. No one can predict with confidence the future of those nations, although Scotland seems to have sent a clear message yesterday. Their future lies primarily in the hands of their own people. There will be complex debates in which different views of sovereignty, economic interests, and political identity will be asserted. Scotland and Northern Ireland may indeed choose different paths, but we do know already that Brexit will, in both cases, play an important role. Most Scottish and Northern Ireland people would prefer still to be part of the European Union, and they remain opposed to Brexit. Indeed, Brexit has strengthened the hands of those who favour Scottish independence and of those who argue for Irish unity. Were it not for the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is necessary to minimise the damage of Brexit, the boost to those campaigning for Irish unity would have been significantly greater. The majority in both nations know what their aspirations counted for in the impulsive scramble for Brexit: precisely nothing. In Northern Ireland, the Unionist community, some of whom are now understandably angry, understand that as well as the nationalist community. Identity will play a central role in the debates ahead. Most Scottish people remain comfortable with their multiple identities. Even those who favour Scottish independence seem happy to consider themselves British as well as Scottish and European. In Northern Ireland, respect for different identities lies at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement, which acknowledges the right of each person to choose to be British or Irish or both, and all that under the umbrella of a shared European identity that provided the overall context for the peace process. Into those china shops of delicate, interwoven identities strode the great bull of Brexit, asserting the purity and superiority of one single identity on its triumphant rosette, Englishness. Either Scotland or Northern Ireland or both could opt to leave the United Kingdom in the years ahead, or if not, they will remain within the UK, disaffected and unhappy to be deprived of their European identity and determined one day to reclaim it. And things are beginning to stir in the Welsh valleys too. In conclusion, let me turn to the sixth and final battle in relation to Britain and Europe, the battle to keep the spirit of Europe alive. The UK witnessed over the past few years perhaps the most enthusiastic and well-attended demonstrations of European enthusiasm that the EU has seen. The immediate aim of those events has been stopped in its tracks by the UK's departure from the European Union. Beyond that, the more modest ambition of what is almost certainly a significant majority of British people to have a closer relationship with Europe than that being pursued has been sidelined for the moment by the decision to proceed with a hard Brexit of a kind dismissed as a non-runner during the referendum by those campaigning for Brexit and not put openly to the British people in the 2019 general election. But if the short-term aim and ambition of British pro-Europeans have run into some buffers, their aspirations remain as valid, their values as legitimate, and their cause as important as ever. Although in Ireland we know a few things about keeping flames alive, I would be hesitant to try to prescribe how British European hopes might best be nurtured with a view to their ultimate vindication. However, the process could usefully start by recognising and reflecting proudly on the immense contribution that the United Kingdom has made to shaping the European Union over the last half-century, including, as Jan said, the contribution made by many individuals like Julian Priestley. It could involve recalling the achievements to which EU membership has contributed, the personal friendships it has made possible across the continent, the remarkable improvement of relations between Britain and Ireland, the delicate peace itself in Northern Ireland, the vast array of educational, cultural, and employment opportunities for young people, the enhanced stability and prosperity on our shared continent, the decent values on which the EU continues to give leadership, and the creation of complex European institutions which, for all their imperfection, have shown that they have some potential, in the words of Aeschylus, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world. Above all, pro-Europeans in the UK should not be intimidated by the assertiveness of compatriots who have long wanted to turn the clock back to an imaginary past, or by the belligerence of those who mistake swagger for patriotism. The task of remaining undaunted is difficult in a country in which much of the so-called news is not news in any real sense, and in which so often on TV and radio, trite and baseless views are given extensive airtime, in which it has sometimes seemed that every expert, if no counter-expertise exists, must be balanced by an nincompoop. My reflections this evening are inspired by my immense affection and admiration for the UK, a major reason for my continued modest involvement in public debate. The Millwall Football Club chant, "No one likes us, but we don't care," may reflect the attitudes of some Brexiteers. However, it is an anthem I reject absolutely as far as the United Kingdom is concerned. While there has been some exasperation in Ireland, even occasionally resentment at the British government's approach to Brexit, the underlying friendship remains deep. Shakespeare captures better than Millwall Football Club the aspiration to enduring affection between our two islands. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds. And of course, Britain and its people have very many friends in every corner of Europe. When I arrived at Oxford as an undergraduate in 1972, in Julian's footsteps, as it were, the murderous IRA campaign was at its height, and Bloody Sunday, just 6 months previously, had left many civilians dead in Derry. Despite the difficulties of those times, I experienced nothing but welcome and friendship. Diversity was celebrated rather than endured. Tolerance, including respect for other nationalities and points of views, was not an option, but the very air we breathed at Balliol. That remains, I am certain, the authentic Britain. I look forward one day to a reassertion of that Britain, to its unqualified openness to other people, backgrounds, beliefs, and ideas, including friendship with neighbouring countries, to a restored recognition that true sovereignty is something to be judiciously employed and sometimes shared, to an awareness that many of the great issues faced by our societies transcend the borders with our neighbours, to the knowledge that we're infinitely stronger when we address those issues together. Speaking of universities, the UK's decision to withdraw from the Erasmus programme that offered so many young British people opportunities to broaden their cultural, educational and linguistic horizons was particularly regrettable. In some ways, the Erasmus decision is, of course, relatively unimportant compared to other Brexit policies that will have a bigger impact on the UK's prosperity and influence. But in its way, the withdrawal from Erasmus stands out. No Brexit decision was more gratuitous, short-sighted or unnecessary. It will be one of the first Brexit decisions to be reversed by a Labour government or otherwise. And being so manifestly dismissive of a coming generation's aspirations, far from cutting the UK off from the continent, it will help to keep the spirit of Europe alive amongst the generations that will determine the UK's future. Julian Priestley believed in openness and engagement. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that they shaped his life. That the United Kingdom has for the moment turned somewhat inwards is not the end of Julian's life's work. On the contrary, it is a reminder, as we remember him today, of the ongoing importance of that work. Julian believed, as the title of his book reminds us, in political battles. His message to us today would be that the struggle for Britain's soul must continue, gently, judiciously, and respectfully. I mentioned at the outset that Julian remained a presence at Oxford long after the end of his undergraduate days. I believe that his wisdom and passion are similarly still present with us today. I will allow Teddy Kennedy the final word. If I may adapt slightly the final words of his address to the Democratic Convention in 1980, in which he transformed his concession of defeat into a stirring call to arms. For Julian, a few years ago, this campaign came to an end. But for all those whose concerns were his concerns, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die. Thank you very much.
Bobby, there's great applause around all the table. We can't hear it, but we can see it. That was absolutely superb. You have given us great hope, and I think that you have energized us, because you began your 6 new battles in addition to Julian's political battles by saying that political defeat must not become defeatism. And I think that occasionally one feels exhausted with so many battles. But hey, I think today we can go forward and we can take on board each of the 6 battles that you suggested that we should engage in. So I think that is marvelous. So I don't think, have we got any questions from around the table? I think I might, you very carefully and I think very sensibly said, Bobby, that, you know, at the moment, the time is not right for us as a country to be seeking to rejoin the European Union. I believe that to be absolutely right and fair, and that's where I stand. But I know that some people probably sitting around our virtual table will be thinking, well, gosh, you know, what conditions would the EU pose for a future renewed application from the UK to rejoin the EU? Dim distant future, but I mean, should we be working towards things? I don't know. What do you think the future conditions might be?
Well, obviously, it goes without saying that British people must make their own decisions about when it's appropriate to press for another referendum. It's just my view that it would be premature. But I think, sorry, I just lost the trouble. Would you say that? What was the question again, just briefly, Jan? Sorry.
No, so if in future we wanted to...
Oh, yes. Sorry, no, I remember that. Sorry.
What would the EU conditions be? Yes.
Well, look, it's very premature to work out conditions. I mean, we know that the conditions for membership will be extremely detailed, and there would be a negotiation. There are people who have worked in Europe who have got a bit exasperated with the UK, and there are a small number who say good riddance. We're glad to be rid of them. But that certainly isn't my view, and I don't believe that it is the view of the overwhelming majority of people, because Europe is weaker without the UK, and the UK contributed and can contribute again greatly to the European Union. As we know, it was a very influential member state. I think that at this stage, you know, the 2 things to say are first of all, that I believe, although again, it's just my view, that the UK would be welcomed back if it chose to do so, but also that there would have to be some clear commitment or clarity that it wasn't going to have another referendum a few years later. I mean, it would be a historic decision to rejoin. And I think it would have to involve some degree of long-term commitment. I think that would be the main condition that would somehow have to be fulfilled.
Okay, are there questions now? I haven't got any questions coming through, which is very frustrating. Oh, there's a question in the chat. Question in the chat. Oh, there is one coming through, maybe. But Bobby, going on from the UK as a whole wishing to rejoin the EU, which is dim, distant future. What about Scotland? I mean, if Scotland were to have another referendum, which they might, and if the Scottish people decided to leave the Union of the United Kingdom and wish to be part of the European Union, would that be possible?
Well, I strongly believe that it would. I think, the situation of Spain is quite distinctive because the Spanish government has understandable concerns about Catalonia, and it doesn't want at this stage to send positive messages about a smooth path for the constituent parts of current countries that might want to join the European Union. But I think there would be a lot of enthusiasm overall, and I think the Spanish would take a constructive approach if Scotland wished to join the European Union, and people can see the enthusiasm that is quite deeply rooted in Scotland, and there would be no reason that an independent Scotland would not be welcomed into the European Union. There was a letter recently by a few hundred cultural leaders calling for the European institutions now to issue a statement saying that they would welcome Scotland joining the European Union. I don't think that particular thing will happen because that's not the way that Europe works, because the European Council, which would be the key institution, doesn't adopt positions on theoretical possibilities. And also, I don't think it would, the other member states would consider it opportune to put pressure on Spain in particular to start adopting formal positions on Scottish accession. But I do think that if and when that should arise, and that will be, or at least in my view should be, essentially a matter for the Scottish people, I think such an application in due course would be greeted warmly. And I think the process for negotiating membership would be much easier than that of any previous applicant for membership of the European Union.
Thank you, that's interesting. Somebody's put in the chat that they think that Chris Patton wants to intervene. Chris, is it true? Do you want to intervene? If so, I'm sure you can be unmuted. Yes, Christopher Patton of Barnes. You're muted, Chris. Unmute. That's fine. Yeah, good.
Yeah, first of all, Bobby, that was a terrific lecture, and Julian Priestley would have loved it and would have been very proud of his friendship with you, listening to you give it. I want to ask one very simple, one very direct question. Is there any way in which Northern Ireland can be in the customs union without there being a border in the Irish Sea? Or is there any way that Northern Ireland can be outside the customs union without there being a border through Ireland?
Well, I think if one goes back to the problem that has arisen in Northern Ireland is not a problem dreamed up by Europe or by Ireland. It is the essential problem of combining Brexit, and particularly a hard form of Brexit in which the London government will not accept to maintain the veterinary and plant health rules and so on, with the continued existence of the single market. So there have to be controls somewhere. And I mean, the notion that you can somehow ignore the problems isn't possible. Now, the decision of the London government to leave the EU customs union made things much more difficult. And the decision not to adopt a Norway position as well. So if the UK were to rejoin the customs union one day, it would certainly simplify the problems for Northern Ireland, but it wouldn't get rid of them completely.
And in the meantime?
Well, in the meantime, we're faced with a very real problem with the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, it is now a matter of international law. It was negotiated with great difficulty. It is imperfect, but it's there to solve a real problem that arose because of Brexit and because of the hard form of Brexit chosen by Boris Johnson. So the two things that need to happen are, one, that it needs to be implemented. There is no alternative to it. If you get rid of it, you go back to square one and you don't have any alternative outcome, which is going to be better for anybody, including for the unionists, because there's a real problem to be solved. So on the one hand, it has to be implemented in good faith, and it has to be implemented jointly with the European Union, not unilaterally. And it has to be implemented in a way that makes quite clear that it is permanent. Because if the London government gives the impression that it's in some way unilateral, or that, you know, it's so bad that we'll have to look at it again, that only encourages hostility and indeed the forces of darkness who found their way onto the streets not that long ago. But that's one thing. So it needs to be implemented in good faith and clearly. But the other thing is it needs to be implemented flexibly. And on that, you know, both sides have a responsibility to try and find further flexibilities. The European Union has recently announced a few adjustments that make it more flexible. They should seek further ones. But the main thing that could happen to make it operate in a way that was less difficult for the unionists would be for the UK to commit to maintaining the animal and plant veterinary standards that apply in the European Union, which is more or less what the standards are now. So both sides need to look, you know, honestly and openly at the flexibilities that are possible while remaining absolutely determined to implement the protocol.
Bobby, there are loads of questions in the chat now. One thing that you talked about in your 6 battles was about words breaking down barriers, and about conspiracies of silence, and the need to tell people about the truth about the European Union. And there's one question is, how could one make the EU's values and EU citizenship tangible and visible again to the public, not just in the UK, but across the EU?
Well, the first thing I always say about the European Union is that it is imperfect. You know, like every country and organization and political party and civil service department, it is imperfect. So one has to acknowledge the imperfections. But as I said in my speech, anybody who is sincere about saying that we will remember those who died in the Great Wars has to recognize the role that Europe has played in creating peace and stability on the continent of Europe. And there is a tendency sometimes for people to say, well, that's all in the past. We have to dream up new things. But that remains of fundamental importance, especially if you have a government that gratuitously sends gunboats to try and resolve a fishing disagreement. I mean, I'm not saying that was tantamount to starting a war, but it shows a very dangerous mentality and is a reminder of the type of activities that the European Union was created to avoid. I think you need education. You know, if language is to have meaning, very basic education, primary and secondary school level, and education at home and children reading books is probably the most important thing that can be done to reassert the value of words and of truth. I think also we now have a conference on the future of Europe that is starting, and I think it's being formally launched on Sunday. And this is an opportunity for the citizens of Europe, unfortunately not at this stage for the citizens of the United Kingdom, to have a say in a bottom-up way in national debates through a common European portal, through national exercises, to give their view on what they want Europe to be. Unfortunately, there isn't going to be a perfect outcome to all of this, because that's the nature of every organization. I mean, if one of you sat down and decided what the shape of Europe should be, then it might look beautiful, but it is a coming together of 27 democracies. And we have to cope, for example, at the moment with Poland and Hungary, whose values are not in line with the broad thrust of what Europe wants. So I think we have to keep trying to make the right decisions in Europe while being aware that we will make wrong ones. We have to keep trying to explain those to the public. We have to try to look at education levels in general, you know, to try to ensure that cheap populism doesn't win elections. in the countries that are still in the European Union. It's not possible in the UK at the moment, although probably in Scotland they could do it. But to have some particular modules of education about Europe, educating what it is about. But all of this is an uphill struggle, because whatever people of goodwill might try to do in public debate, they're facing people who, as we saw in the Brexit referendum and since then and throughout indeed Britain's membership of the European Union, who will quite literally tell lies. These are, it sounds harsh, and maybe in Britain people don't want to say that at the moment because Britain has been divided and families have been divided and friends have been divided. But Brexit was based on lies. And then you have, an absurd tabloid media, which you can see even today, the front pages covering the gunboats being sent to Jersey, and it's preposterous. So the battle is very difficult, and I think each of us in our own way should just try with our friends, or if we're politicians through our politics, or if we're journalists through our journalism, to explain calmly and rationally what Europe is, including its faults, and work in this long-term uphill battle for a more accurate understanding of Europe.
As you said earlier, there is a global assault on truth, and this is part of it, really. You also talked about education as being a bulwark, I think you said, against populism, and you mentioned Erasmus earlier, and sitting where I am in a university, Erasmus is extremely important. And somebody's pointed out in the chat that Wales has already committed to restore Erasmus, which is wonderful. Are there any other areas of European integration that in which regional governments could participate?
So it's a very good question. I would add on Erasmus that the Irish government has announced and decided that it will fund any students from Northern Ireland from any background, unionist or otherwise, to participate in Erasmus. So, all I can say on that is really that London has tried to take additional powers to itself away from Wales and Scotland in the context of Brexit, and is trying to bypass them, for example, in the terms of allocation of funding, and will certainly not give any encouragement to things like Wales trying to remain part of Erasmus or Scotland taking similar decisions. So I suppose the three elements that will come together are the enthusiasm in Scotland and Wales to do it, the enthusiastic response of Europe to any request that is within Europe's rules and not in contradiction of the Brexit agreement, which is the EU has to treat as legally binding. And the third factor is London not encouraging any of that. So, nothing else just occurs to me offhand, but I'm glad to hear that Wales is going to continue to participate in Erasmus.
Fantastic, but it's great that Ireland is also going to help Northern Irish. That's brilliant. There's one question here. Do you think that the presence of a very different kind of administration in Washington can have an impact on the 6 battles that you mentioned?
Oh, undoubtedly. It will have a battle, first of all, an influence in the battle for truth, because Trump basically had, his pronouncements had no relationship to reality, and he didn't care about reality, as we know from the very first day when he exaggerated the crowds who attended his inauguration, alternative facts as they were called. So Biden, by his very presence and by appointing people to his administration and by encouraging people more widely in the United States who share such a commitment to truth, or just a basic decency in public life, that will have a big impact, and that will, in its way, trickle out around the world. Because before Biden was elected, some people, like in Brazil, indeed Boris Johnson, thought they had a friend in the White House that they could play footsie with, that it sort of provided cover for the worst excesses of populism. But now they don't have a similar person in the White House, and indeed they will be constrained somewhat by that presence if they want to develop, and we've already seen that, if they want to develop a close relationship. But another thing that has changed with the election of Biden is, of course, the relationship with the European Union. The United States, President Biden has already had a Zoom meeting with the members of the European Council, and he's going to have, in a few weeks' time, a meeting in person with the European Council, something Donald Trump never did. And this is merely a reflection of reality, that the United States and Europe share profound values, and and need to work together on everything from climate change to the Iran deal and so on, all the things that Trump wasn't doing. So that's another big impact of Biden. And another one is, of course, on Northern Ireland, where I think it's very likely that the decision in London to back away from the breach of international law was influenced in part by the arrival of Biden in the White House. I was reading recently I saw a transcript of an interview that a journalist had done with Sir Robert Armstrong, the former cabinet secretary, about the months after the attempt to murder Margaret Thatcher in Brighton. And what struck me more than anything was the influence that Reagan had on Thatcher, because she was committed to the principle of trying to reach a deal with the Irish government on the Anglo-Irish Agreement. She was very courageous in that, but also she kept referring to, when she was talking to Robert Armstrong, to the fact that Reagan was raising it with her every time he spoke to her, and that will be even stronger with Biden, because Biden is the most Irish American president since Kennedy, and he understands Ireland well. He understands the balances of the Good Friday Agreement, and equally importantly, he has people around him who understand that sort of thing. So I think in all those areas, like the value of language, the relationship between the United States and Europe, including in support of multilateralism, and the Northern Ireland issue, I think Biden's election will make a difference.
That's good news. Carrying on the sort of Irish theme, somebody's put a question in the chat saying that there's no doubt of the damage done to the formal relationship between Britain and Ireland, no matter how much we like each other as individuals. Have you any suggestions as to how that important relationship can be repaired?
Well, I wouldn't exaggerate the damage. It's very true that there has been damage, and certainly the high point of my career, for which I don't claim particular credit because so many other people were involved, but I was the ambassador in London when the Queen visited Dublin, the first time that a British had visited an independent Ireland. And the emotion of that occasion, when she laid a wreath in honour of people who died for Irish freedom, and the Irish president joined her in laying a wreath for Irish people who died in British uniform, it was possibly the greatest act of reconciliation in the world in modern history. And when you think of the history of our islands, with a longer rivalry and conflict than perhaps any other two nations in the world, it was a remarkable thing. Now, since then, Brexit has challenged that. First of all, because it unsettles Northern Ireland, which nobody wants to see, and it also unsettles the bilateral relationship, because Ireland wasn't taken into account at all. I mean, I said Scotland and Northern Ireland weren't taken into account, but Brexit, we had sat around the table with Britain as close partners, often working towards the same ends. And I'm glad on this Zoom call there are people like David Haney and Nigel Chinwell and people that I had the honour to sit around the table with working together, and that was taken away. So undoubtedly, it has been damaged. And also the relationship has been damaged because we have a different psychology. You know, when Ireland talks about going global, we don't mean the same thing. We're absolutely in favour of going global. When we talk about sovereignty, and there's probably no country in the world more attached to sovereignty because of our history than Ireland, we don't mean a narrow sovereignty that can be buried in our back garden. We mean sovereignty that is to be used courageously and confidently in the wider world. So in those ways it has changed. But having said that, you know, the number of Irish people living in the UK is vast. The number of British people who've come to live here is growing and growing all the time. In 2019, for the first time, more people moved from Britain to live in Ireland than from Ireland to Britain. When I go out for a walk, I hear English voices all the time. They're involved in every aspect of our society. So that personal thing is one very important glue between our two countries. We also have immense shared interests in trade. We have immense shared responsibilities in Northern Ireland. So I think the relationship is not as good as it was in 2011 when the Queen visited, but it's vastly better than it was in the great sweep of our history. And I think we will get it back fully on an even keel. But you know, to the question, what can be done? I think one thing is not to act unilaterally. I mean, the peace process in Northern Ireland was only possible because both identities in Northern Ireland were given equal recognition, both aspirations were given equal recognition. And that was because the two governments worked together over 30 years towards that end. And, you know, when Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern worked together, I saw them sometimes working together. They weren't like leaders to government, they were like brothers. And similarly, Albert Reynolds and John Major deserve enormous credit for what happened in Northern Ireland. But we've seen, you know, in recent times, a sort of maybe a psychology that in London, not in London in general, of course, and I think there's going to be another Labour mayor there, but London in terms of Downing Street, that forgets that the progress has been based on working together. Now, there is a meeting of the Intergovernmental Conference, the British Irish Governmental Conference, coming in the coming weeks, and that's very good. But it is worrying that the announcement about the non-prosecution of cases of people accused of murder in the past was announced unilaterally. I mean, I don't like the decision itself, and people may take a different view, but the fact that the London government acted unilaterally on that, as it did in relation to the protocol twice, is worrying. So yes, I think we need to keep calm. We need in Ireland to remember that Britain is not Nigel Farage, it's not Boris Johnson. You know, there are different views in Britain, and we need to continue to work together on Northern Ireland as we have done over many decades.
Thank you. There are lots more questions. You mentioned earlier the importance of the work of individuals and the views of individuals, and the fact that Julian as an individual had done so much to shape the European Union. There's one question in the chat, which is, what importance would you attach to track 2 diplomacy, whereby non-UK government individuals can help nurture EU-UK relations?
I think that's very important, and there are several such initiatives underway at the moment. I know that Paul Adamson in Brussels through Encompass is involved in one of those exercises, and the European Policy Centre as well. And they're absolutely very much to be encouraged. And I noticed when I participated in their events on Zoom that there are a lot of Irish voices involved, because Irish people are, I suppose, particularly sensitive to the future relationship between Britain and the European Union. And maybe we have a slight insight that others don't have to the same extent, because we follow British politics so closely. You know, everything that happens in the UK is significant, is a headline. The first item on the news, on the Irish radio news at lunchtime, was the Hartlepool by-election. So, you know, we're outside, but we follow the nuances of what's happening. So Ireland is very much involved in that track 2 process. And but, you know, it's not for the moment going to change the world. What else can you do except that? You have to keep the channels open between non-governmental actors, so that, you know, we in Europe understand what's happening in Britain and the thought process, the evolution of thinking, and vice versa. So it's a thoroughly good thing to do, but it's a very long process, and it's not going to change the game for some time.
We also have to keep finding opportunities to bring real people together, don't we? I mean, it's great that you and Paul and lots of people involved, but I fear that now that we're no longer members of the European Union, so many of the twinning opportunities, etc., will diminish, and that would be immensely sad. So,
just to go back, I mean, when you mentioned twinning, I don't see why twinning can't continue with places in Wales and Scotland, or indeed England. You know, that's something that can continue. But the personal contacts are so important, and you're right, it's not just politicians and civil servants. But my own experience was as a civil servant, and before the Northern Ireland troubles broke out 50 years ago, British ministers and Irish ministers literally didn't know each other. Irish and British civil servants didn't know each other. And over many years of working on the peace process, but even more importantly, in terms of numbers and daily contact, working in Europe meant that generations of British and Irish officials and politicians got to know each other and like each other. And even when we disagreed, which we often did, we found that we shared a way of thinking, and that we spoke the same language linguistically, as well as in a different way. So yeah, that is a really big loss. And the sort of friendships that were developed between many of the people who are on this Zoom call will clearly continue. But I'm very worried about the next generation of British civil servants whose bread will be buttered on the side of Brexit and who won't be sitting around the tables in Brussels. And I'm fearful that while relations will be good, they will not be that sort of empathetic, automatic, close thing that the British and Irish had in Europe, which probably no two other countries had to the same extent.
And so Helen Ghosh, carrying on from that sort of theme, says, thank you for the moving description of your welcome in Oxford and at Balliol as an undergraduate. Current students seem unmoved about Brexit in Europe compared with their interest in climate change and identity issues. How might we fire them up, apart from inviting you to speak to them, of course?
Well, first of all, I accept the invitation to come and speak. And Helen, I'm wearing my Balliol tie in honour of Julian. Well, I certainly don't think, and I'm sure you don't think either, that the students should be distracted from their interest in climate change. But you know, I look, Britain's membership of the European Union, and now for the foreseeable future, its relationship with the European Union, is vastly important, including in the area of climate change. You know, you could invite somebody to come from the European Commission to talk to your students about climate change. I mean, maybe my daughter went to Oxford maybe 15 years ago. She was at St. Anne's, and I got to know in a way how Oxford had changed in many ways since my day, and it changed for the better in many ways. I mean, for example, the way individual students were welcomed carefully in advance by other students, and then they weren't sort of just given a key and told to go to their room. It changed in that way. But I think one of the things that changed was maybe less interest in politics, as it were. I mean, when I was there seemed to be a lot of people who were members of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and the Lib Dems, and the Liberal Party. And of course, in the case of Balliol, they were Trotskyists and Maoists and every variety of left-wing parties that they belonged to. I think the more modern generation, to see through my daughter, was more interested in things like climate change and human rights rather than things that could be seen as party political issues. But the fact you asked the question just makes it, just underlines the real difficulty there is ahead. But I mean, surely the fact that Britain's relationship with Europe is so important for the UK and for its prosperity and for its influence and for its role in the world, surely there must be some way, not a magic wand for Balliol alone, but for the British education system, including at school level, to do more.
I absolutely agree with you, and we will do more in Oxford. I do despair a bit sometimes of the British education system and the fact that they've had antipathy for many years about talking about Europe, but that's by the by. So there's a question here from Carol Tung, who says there's now talk of a formation of progressive alliance of Labour, Greens, Lib Dems ahead of a future general election in order to beat the Conservatives. Clearly you're not a Brit, but do you believe that such an alliance is a precondition for also articulating a strong pro-European stance? Do you think that would help? Give us your...
Well, look, I mean, I really, you know, in terms of Britain's relationship with Europe, I feel a certain, if you like, right or competence to have a view because I was ambassador in London and because I understood Britain in Europe for so long. But in terms of the specificities of party policy, that really is beyond me. But what I will say is that, you know, I mentioned that in the election in December 2019, a majority of people voted for parties that wanted a second referendum for various reasons. So there wasn't then, and there isn't now, an overwhelming majority, or probably any majority, for people who are anti-European. In fact, there's almost certainly a significant majority of people who either want to get back to Europe or who would like a closer relationship with Europe than the one that Boris Johnson has. So, I mean, I think I'd make the observation that it's worth remembering that taking a number of political parties together, and of course, one day maybe the Labour Party will become the largest party again, but taking those parties together, their views generally outweigh those of the Conservative Party. Their support outweighs that of the Conservative Party. And I imagine at the moment they also have a lot of shared values on the sort of sleaze, which is mind-boggling, and the 52% of people believing that Boris Johnson said that the bodies should be allowed to pile high. I mean, I really am somebody who's instinctively in any way anti-British. I'm in fact deeply pro-British, but I do find it staggering. I mean, if an Irish Taoiseach or minister had said either let the bodies pile high or let it rip, or who had been involved in the Arcuri affair or in any one of a number of, or taking donations for redecorating Downing Street or any of these things that have happened, they would be gone within 24 hours, gone. So it says something about public standards, and it also says something about the media, because our media is pretty good at hounding people when they do something wrong. So I'm sorry, that's a bit of a rambling answer, but I do recognize that there are many parties in the UK that share many views, and one of those most fundamental things is a desire to have a closer relationship with Europe than the one that's there at the moment.
It's quite a funny question here. It's very political, but somebody points out that a lot of politicians these days, leading politicians, can't be trusted. In fact, you named a few ways in which politicians couldn't be trusted. So have you got any advice for diplomats as they negotiate with politicians who can't be trusted? That's a very good question.
Well, get it in writing.
Oh yeah, that's very good.
Yeah, but yeah. I remember working in the European Commission, my very first day working in a cabinet in the European Commission, and I was sent off to my first meeting of all the cabinets, and there was some very sensitive issue that was relevant to our portfolio. And I came back to our chef de cabinet and I said that somebody had promised that he would do something by a certain date. And my chef de cabinet said to me, "Well, that sounds good, but get it in writing." And I was astonished, coming from the Irish Civil Service, that you would actually insist on getting something in writing. But that wasn't, I mean, I'm a great admirer of the European Commission. I think it does an extraordinarily difficult job bringing together the 27 countries and producing the European interest, and does so with immense professionalism. But you know, I joke about getting it in writing, but you know, some people say still that the issue of Northern Ireland and the protocol should not have been dealt with first, and it could all be sorted out now. But boy, like when you look at the unwillingness of the Unionists to contemplate any sort of recognition of the North-South dimension in this context, I'm absolutely more strongly convinced than ever that it was right to get that in writing. And I think that you know the whole thing of the protocol, you know, okay, the government in London, in an extraordinary way, announced that it actually intended to break international law, but it backed down from that. So the fact that it was in writing was helpful. So that's the first thing. I think be realistic. You know, you have to, look. I can be critical of any politicians I want, either in Ireland or the UK, because I'm retired. But I think the Irish government has to deal with the British government as it is, in the same way it had to deal with the Trump government as it was. So you know, it is developing a reasonable relationship with Boris Johnson, and that's what it should do. But it needs to keep its hand on its wallet at the same time.
Yes, we'll quote you. So I think, I mean, it's 7:25 now. We're going to finish very shortly, but somebody put a question in the chat. I'm sorry, I've lost their name, which is, what would Julian be saying to us now? What would he be saying to us today?
Well, I think if he were talking to us individually, he'd be asking us about our families, and he'd be asking us how we're enjoying our jobs and enjoying retirement, because he was a very kind and thoughtful and personable person. I'd like to think he'd be saying some of the things that I was saying in my speech. Sure. If he wouldn't, then I got the speech all wrong. But I think he would just tell us to keep fighting the good fight, because it's not just about politics. It's not just about party politics. When you think of the way the world has gone over the 20th century, when you think of the wars and the suffering and the bloodshed and the starvation around the world, and when you see the way China is going with its treatment of the Uyghurs and its treatment of Hong Kong and its totally different system, and when Putin marches up and down on the borders of Ukraine, when you look at climate change, where Europe provides some leadership, to make Europe work, and hopefully, fingers crossed, one day for the UK to return to making Europe work, is more than party politics. It's about the future of our world. You know, today is actually Grandparents' Day, because one of the school of one of my grandchildren sent me a little video that they made of the children talking about Grandparents' Day. But maybe today is a day to remember that the sort of decisions that we make and the sort of energy that we bring to our values is really something that will affect our grandchildren.
I think that's a great note on which to finish. I think you've done the most fantastic job this evening. It was a wonderful speech. It was truly inspiring. You have given us hope. You've given us renewed trust, I think, in the role of public servants as well, because you're a very fine public servant, Bobby, as was Julian. And I think we should always remember that. And I think that that hope that you've given us will enable us to go forward and ensure that hope and history rhyme, as you put it, in the words of Seamus Heaney. So thank you very much indeed. And to everybody sitting around the table, I would say that next year, we hope to do an in-person and hybrid lecture, which will be the fourth one, Julian Priestley Lecture. It will be at Somerville. We don't have, or they don't, the organisers don't have a subject for it yet. So any subjects on a postcard, please, or rather on an email to Belinda, to Mike, or to Richard. But most of all, thank you so much, Bobby. That was absolutely splendid. And we look forward to reading it as well. And I'm sure it will be quoted in many ways and plagiarized, not least by me. So, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you.